Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series on revolutionary ideas, we're going to be talking about an idea with a long history, some of it revolutionary, some of it not, but a particular moment in that history. I'm speaking to the historian Fara Dabhoiwala, who's just published a history of the idea of free speech, about free speech, but more particularly, what happened to the idea of free speech in 1859. That's the year that Darwin published On the Origin of Species, but we're talking about another book that appeared that year, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Farah, we're going to talk about a particular point in the history of the idea of free speech in the second half of the 19th century that changed, if not everything, certainly a lot. But before we get there, it's probably helpful to frame that development in the wider story. And in that wider story, one of the questions is what we mean by free speech in the first place. And as people use it today, it's often treated as a kind of ahistorical idea, some timeless idea. We know what we mean when we talk about free speech, and the question is just, are you for it or are you against it? But it is clearly not a timeless idea. It has a history, and it also has a kind of beginning. I mean, the idea of free speech had to be invented. It doesn't just exist out there in nature. So maybe to start, we should try and work out when the story starts. When do you think, in a way that we would recognize the term, the idea of free speech comes from?
Well, our idea of free speech is concentrated on the notion that people have a general right to speak out on matters of public concern. Political free speech is really at the core of that. And that's an idea that only really emerges around 1700. It is true that before 1700, there are plenty of other notions of free speech. The notions of free speech go back a long way. There's a classical notion of free speech. There's a humanist idea about scholarly free speech. There's a post-Reformation Protestant idea about freedom of conscience, which has a lot to do with freedom of expression. But the point about all these earlier notions of free speech is there are always exceptional modes. They are not the norm. They are special kinds of speech, and they're very clearly demarcated with boundaries. You may not, for example, if you're doing scholarly free speech, you cannot lie, you cannot slander people, you cannot talk about politics. Similarly, religious freedom of expression is always bounded by the principle that it shouldn't affect public affairs. It shouldn't be a matter of talking about things that are not spiritual. This all changes around 1700, and one important reason for that, why you get the emergence of our concept of free speech, is that there's a media revolution. There's a huge explosion of political speech to begin with in England. And that comes about because of the collapse of licensing, the collapse of the censorship of print that previously always had been the rule. And so in England, for the first time, you get this explosion of political news and newspapers especially, and pamphleteering, and people talking more freely than ever before without any kind of prior restraint about the politics of the day. And by and large, people grow to enjoy this, and they even celebrate it, and they start to use liberty of the press as a great slogan to celebrate why the English are in the vanguard of the world's societies and why they are a freer nation than anywhere else. But this notion of liberty of the press is always very untheorized. It's a very subjective notion, and it's balanced by the idea that there is also such a thing as licentiousness. And so, as contemporary observers love to point out, what you get is a public sphere where people in opposition to the government, for example, are always going on about how they should deserve greater liberty of the press, and liberty of the press is a great thing and it should be expanded, and so on and so forth. And the moment they get into power, they clamp down severely on licentiousness, and they call then things that they don't approve of licentiousness. So that's the earliest notion of liberty of the press. And the reason that it's very under-theorized is also that it's actually goes against all the things that people have for millennia known to be true about speech and expression, especially political speech. The first of those is that it's a powerful action in the world, that speech is a potent thing. If you go back to any pre-modern society, there are endless sayings about this. There's a great biblical verse in the Old Testament that goes, "The stroke of the whip maketh marks in the flesh, but the stroke of the tongue breaketh the bones."
It's almost the opposite of sticks and stones may break my bones.
Exactly the opposite. And sticks and stones is actually, it's very telling. It only emerges in the early 19th century. That's a concept. So before that, people have exactly the opposite idea, that speech at its most powerful is more powerful than any physical violence. And you find this throughout English literature. John Donne has a wonderful similar saying. Burton in the early 17th century in The Anatomy of Melancholy makes a similar point. Until the 18th century, people take that for granted. So that's the first thing.
The implication of that, therefore, is that people wouldn't go around thinking that there's such a thing as free violence. Violence is the sort of thing that should be just allowed on principle, because it's a form of expression, to be given free rein. And they made the same assumption about speech, that the idea that just on principle anyone should be allowed to say anything was the equivalent to saying people should be allowed to cause physical harm.
And punch each other. Yes, absolutely.
So it had to be regulated.
Had to be regulated. And every society around the globe before 1700 regulates speech very carefully. It's not just governments and churches that have laws about expression. It's not just governments and churches that censor print. It's also individuals, members of these societies, that are endlessly going to law against one another about bad speech. Because the other point about speech is that it can cause harm, and that it can harm individual reputations. It can cause political chaos, lies and misinformation in particular. These are things that people are obsessed about, with good reason, as far back as we can see people talking about it. So the earliest English law, for example, about fake news, false news, as it's actually literally termed, dates from the 13th century. It's a perennial concern, because everyone knows that if you allow lies and slanders to circulate, they will grow, they will spread, they will motivate people to take other actions, and that's harmful to individuals and to the common good.
So there was an earlier version of this, wasn't there, during and after the English Civil War? There was an equivalent explosion of print, and some people at least trying to justify this, maybe not to theorize it, but to justify it. But it didn't last. Does that feed into this later period? Is there a sense that that earlier version of it was a kind of failed experiment in free speech?
Not actually, no. So first of all, in that moment in the 1640s and 50s, most of the attention there is focused on arguing for greater liberty of religious speech and religious conscience. It's not so much about politics, although that does come into it a little bit in small ways. But the main effect of that is that in 1660, when the monarchy is restored, there's a huge backlash against the idea of just allowing people to print freely. Everyone can see that this causes chaos and civil war and conspiracy theories and all the things that actually go back to the Civil War itself, which had been a breakdown of trust and communication as much as actual differences of opinion. And so in 1660, you get an attempt to really strictly regulate the printing press in particular. That only breaks down after the Glorious Revolution for contingent religious and political reasons. It kind of lapses. It's not even a matter of principle that people decide that this shouldn't any longer be the regime. It just isn't workable anymore. And then try and muddle through in different ways. So then you get the explosion of newspapers. And so everyone knows that this is a universe in which there's more information and hence more misinformation. All the early journalists, Defoe and Swift and the rest of them, are absolutely clear about this. This is just causing more partisan strife because people are writing for money, saying whatever they think the politicians will want them to or what the populace will buy. It's mercenary, it's venal, it's not about truth, it's about partisan warfare. And so early 18th century observers of print are very clear-sighted about the dangers of this liberty. And that's another reason why theorists never get a real handle on it as something that they could propose in a systematic way.
And yet there is a celebrated defense of the idea of free speech, particularly freedom of the press, from this period, which weirdly has become, particularly in the United States, something that's treated as part of the timeless account. It's very specific to its context. These are what are called the letters of Cato. The letters of Cato are cited as though they were carved in stone and passed down through the ages. And yet they are a product of this period of extraordinary ferment, controversy, and, for want of a better word, venality, right?
Yes, absolutely. So to begin with, in the early 18th century, you had this idea of liberty versus license. It's a subjective balance. No one can get further than that. But then in 1721, these two journalists write this series of polemical tracts where they celebrate freedom of speech as the foundation of all liberty. And I'll read out the start if you like. One reason this becomes justly famous is its amazing writing. They are very good journalists and it's inspiring stuff. So here's the start of Cato's first letter on free speech, which is endlessly quoted. If you walk into the US Capitol building and go to the place where is celebrated on its walls and ceilings the Constitution and the First Amendment, this is quoted there. Although Americans, because they're a bit solipsistic, don't realize that it came from this text. They think it was by Benjamin Franklin. But anyway, it's by Thomas Gordon. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech, which is the right of every man, as far as by it he does not hurt or control the right of another. And then he goes on to say that whenever freedom of speech is even only a little bit infringed, that's a slippery slope to tyranny. And governments are always trying to amass too much power and to tyrannize and subdue their populations. And you should always be on your guard against such things. So this becomes the weapon of choice for anyone who wants to justify their own speech in the rest of the 18th century. Printers who want to justify printing stuff, opposition journalists, opposition politicians. It's a clarion call for freedom of speech.
It is still, though, understood as a public, I mean, the word public was in what you just read there. It is a public liberty. That is, it is a freedom to express yourself in something that we would recognize as a public space. It's not a private freedom.
Absolutely not. And it's very, very consciously trying to demarcate a sphere of public speech, sphere of public action. All early theories do that. And one of the ways in which they don't actually work, I mean, there are many, many ways in which Cato's letters is just a farrago of assertions that aren't intellectually coherent. But one basic way is that they always have this notion, this presumption that if you just allow people to debate freely, they will agree. And this comes out of the old Protestant ideas about religious dispute as well, that if only we have freedom, ultimately the truth will emerge. And for that reason, they also presume that the public have a kind of common understanding of things if they're only allowed to be free. So Cato's letters starts by articulating the right of every individual, but most of the argument really is about the public. The public will see, the public will be allowed. It's a matter of the commonality. And all early theories of free speech do that because they all presume that the truth will be uniform and singular in all spheres, not just politics. It's a great Enlightenment hope, after all.
But the presumption was mainly what would be being discussed here was the corruption of politicians, in the sense that this is an oppositional position. These journalists at this point were writing from an oppositional perspective, and they were trying to say that people must be free to expose nefarious goings-on in high places. It's quite a narrow sphere if you think about it in terms of the subject matter of free speech, around which presumably the assumption is people will agree when it is shown to them that this person is a rogue, that this person is a rogue.
Exactly. I mean, there are lots of caveats in it about how, of course, freedom of expression, even within that narrow sphere, can cause damage, can cause riots, can cause, honest people to be slandered. But one of the beauties of their rhetoric and their polemic is that they just wave all that away. They shunt that aside. And always the headline is, well, even if it does do those things, the greater good is served by just allowing it to happen. And so they very consciously take on what until then had been the main problem and objection that everyone agreed was a serious difficulty, including John Milton before them and any other theorist, of libel. That's to say, lies about individuals. That's always been held to be beyond the pale. And Trenchard and Gordon in Cato's letters try to get rid of that problem by pretending that ultimately it's always the less powerful attacking the powerful when you talk about free speech, and an honest man, an honest governor has nothing to fear from lies because they will be self-evidently, exposed as untruths. And we know that's not true, but it's very powerfully persuasive.
And that phrase persists into the 21st century, nothing to fear, nothing to hide.
But no one had ever been able to find out who these guys were and exactly what they were up to in this column, which then becomes so influential. They are writing for money. Thomas Gordon is this penniless Scot who comes south to make his fortune as a political writer. He shunts from one politician to another, trying to find something that will make his fortune. And then he hooks up after this disastrous stock market crash, the South Sea bubble bursts in 1721, with this embittered older man who's tried to get a seat in Parliament from the Whig Party, and they've turned him down. So he's totally against them now. Then there's the crash. Everyone is up in arms. So they start attacking the government of the day very viciously, so viciously that they get huge sales and the government tries to shut them down. And when they do that by force, gets them even more readers. It's a classic tale of muckraking politicians. But Thomas Gordon very quickly is wooed by the government, who say, well, you're quite a good writer. Why don't you come over to our side and write for us? And so halfway through the writing of Cato's letters, he starts to moonlight for the government and write exactly the opposite kind of conservative, the people shouldn't be trusted with great freedom of expression. That's dangerous, blah, blah, columns in the government press. And then finally he does jump ship. He goes over, he becomes Robert Walpole's chief propagandist. And for the rest of his life, he goes rich and fat writing government anti-free speech propaganda, as it were. So it's a remarkable story of rhetoric and of venality, but the text itself and the arguments that they put forward and the rhetoric lives on in very powerful ways, especially in the United States.
And it fed directly into the arguments around the First Amendment in their original form. It is that notion of free speech which the First Amendment, in theory at least, seeks to uphold, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's not just that notion, it's actually the text of Cato's letters. It's the go-to text when the rebels in North America start to publicize their demands and start to agitate against the British. It's the obvious go-to text to celebrate their freedom of expression and their freedom of speech. And one of the great phrases from Cato's letters is the bulwark of liberty. Freedom of speech is one of the bulwarks of liberty. That actual phrase is endlessly repeated in the mid and late 18th century, and it goes straight into the Declarations of Rights in 1776 that the states all put out, claiming freedom of speech, and thence it goes into the First Amendment in 1789. So there's an absolutely direct, conscious line from that text into the American Constitution.
So by the end of the 18th century, the idea of free speech has been articulated. It's been articulated in terms of high principle. It has been institutionalized in a way in a very important document, the amendments to the United States Constitution. But it is still a very distinctive notion. It's about public speech. It's focused on the freedom of the press. It particularly exercises journalists above all others. It's about what you can and cannot do in opposition to the powers of the day. It is not about people's private expressions or beliefs. It's not about what happens in what we might call the private sphere. And as you've just said, it's high-ringing principle, but it's journalistic high-ringing principle. It's just a lot of very fancy phrases strung together to sound convincing. And, if you look at them and if you squint in the right light, they do sound quite convincing. What changes we can give a date to it, in 1859, in one of the key philosophical texts of the 19th century, written by one of the great philosophers of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, is a new kind of articulation of the basic philosophical principle of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief. And it's different. It takes the argument somewhere it hadn't been before. And in that sense, it's kind of revolutionary. We'll talk in a bit about what might nonetheless still be wrong with Mill's argument, but what is the big shift that comes in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty?
Well, it is a remarkable text, and if listeners haven't read it before, I highly urge you to go out and read it. It's so readable. He's a great writer and a great thinker. The core of the book On Liberty is that people should be free in their experiments in living, as he puts it somewhere, that people should be allowed to go through life and express their individuality in the ways that they see fit and not be cowed by the main thing he's concerned about is not governmental pressure, but social conformity. And it's easy to see why Mill himself would feel that way. He's spent his life as a heterodox thinker on a variety of hot-button topics, social topics, and he probably felt that very strongly himself.
And he fell in love with a married woman.
Indeed, yes. And then he writes to her at one point, it's lovely. He says, "Harriet, I've had a great idea for a short book on liberty. I think it'll have great sales and people will be interested." And indeed, they still are. So anyway, it's a great text. But at the core of it is the idea that this liberty of experiments of living requires individuality of thought and indeed individuality of expression. Liberty of speech is so at the heart of what he's trying to theorize as necessary for a fulfilling life. And so this is the first attempt, it's really startling, to conceive of free speech as essentially nothing to do with the public sphere. Indeed, he doesn't make the distinction between the public and the private, and not really about the common good, but about the individual. Now, earlier theorists have always used the rhetoric of a person's right. Cato did that. John Milton does that. Different forms of free speech have always been conceived in that way, but they always, more importantly, stressed that this was about a common truth that people would, as the public in general, approach, especially in the political sphere. And James Mill, John Stuart Mill's father, had kind of taken this idea to extremes in his own theories of free speech. It's very interesting. He talks about free speech as a matter for the public, a right of the public. And then when he talks about individual rights, it's all about harms that individuals might incur by others' speech. Your right to your good name and so on can't be infringed by other speech. So John Stuart Mill is the first person to try and articulate this as an individual right.
What makes this distinctive, I think, is it's still about truth in some sense. This is an idea that by allowing people really radical freedom of expression and experiment in how they live. So there's an assumption here that they won't just be talking about it, they may well be living it. Nonetheless, by this method, people will come closer to the truth, because if you stifle how people can live, how they can talk to each other, in the end, you're putting a barrier in a way of arriving at, if not a common understanding, an understanding of the things that are true. And as you suggested, the biggest barrier in the way to that was social and religious pressure to conform to a particular way of living. But it seems to presuppose that individuals are already leading a life in which the sources of their beliefs, the sources of what they think, the sources of their ideas, their inspirations for these experiments in living are themselves coming to them in a relatively free and unhampered way. And that feels like it goes against what we kind of know about the world, which is that the things that people believe, I mean, maybe John Stuart Mill himself is a rather exceptional case. He was a prodigious child. He really did live inside his own head, and he was capable of almost inventing worlds inside his own head. But most people are living the way that they live, not because they are being cowed by the Anglican Church, but because we are all social creatures and we are shaped by the environment around us. And what feels so radical about this is somehow an assumption that we are all individuals capable of finding our own way in the world and deciding what it is we want to do, and by that means arriving at the truth, as though we weren't being shaped by all of the forces, including forces of untruth, that surround us.
I think two things I'd like to say to that. First of all, we should come back to the point about how we're being shaped, because Mill has a very awkward relationship to that. On the one hand, he's clear that social conformity is a terrible thing. On the other hand, he never faces squarely the fact that the media and the public newspapers that he celebrates as, organs of truth and public opinion and so on, clearly could be viewed in other ways too. And at certain points that peeks through in his understanding. But we should come back to that because it's a bigger point about the world in which he's living and other people's ideas about free speech at this time. The other point I'd make is I'm not sure truth is really actually the best way of capturing what he's aspiring people to arrive at. And part of the joy of reading the text is he's very happily hacking away at sacred cows. And one of those is this older idea, which is presumed by all previous theorists of political free speech, that the truth will emerge by itself. Goes back to Milton's religious expression of the idea. The truth is so beautiful and so strong, so powerful. When she shows herself, humans automatically will choose her over untruth. And that's been endlessly rhetorically elaborated on since then. As you said, it's still a trope in our current culture, but it's not true. And Mill is very clear about that. He says it's been endlessly repeated, but it's clearly not true, that truth has some intrinsic power to persuade people. And yet on the other side, on the other hand, it's another tension in Mill himself. He does want to believe in progress and that understanding of the world is progressing forward and that certain truths have been established and so on. So there's a tension there. But what he's really getting at with his idea of liberty, I think, is simply, again, this idea of living in different ways. And the most moving example of that I can recall from the text is when he talks about the Mormons in mid-19th century America. He says, here's this sect of people who are being, and the Mormons at that time were really under military threat from the federal government of the United States. They're being surrounded and, doing battle physically and intellectually. And Mill has this wonderful passage where he says, look, of all the people in the world, I am the least in agreement with the Mormons, either on marriage, which is clearly a nonsense and an invention of human beings that we should all be able to do without. So polygamy for him is abomination, multiplication of marriage. And I also clearly don't believe in their religious views, but they should be left to live in peace as long as they're not harming anyone else. That's the core of it. So I don't think it's about truth. It's just about leaving people to flourish and evolve intellectually to the best of their ability.
So would another way of putting it be that he doesn't believe that people will cohere around something that we call the truth, and that the truth is a sort of beacon that's obscured and free speech will strip away the barriers to it? He doesn't believe that. And he absolutely believes that freedom of speech and expression includes the right to be wrong, completely wrong, and carry on being wrong. No one's going to let you be wrong on the path to being right. But he also believes that a world full of people, many of whom are wrong, will include the people who are right. Doesn't he believe that? That it's not about agreement. I mean, he sort of occasionally seemed to think in political terms that there are versions of liberal politics where people might approach forms of agreement. But nonetheless, even in that context, they only do it if the people who are wrong are really allowed to be wrong in a very vocal and visible way. But it is in order that you avoid the risk of stifling the people who are right. Isn't that still a part of Mill's argument?
I think that is. But as you express it there, I can see the tension between saying this is all good and this is an equilibrium that will lead to a flourishing society, which is sometimes what he's tending towards. And on the other hand, the danger that if too many people believe the wrong things, then you might have harmful consequences for the society as a whole. And he's constantly trying to tack between the two. And this might be a good point to bring in the way in which this is, at a meta level, a problematic argument and a problematic text, because he's talking here explicitly, and there's an extraordinary paragraph where he sets this out very explicitly, only about advanced societies.
So the right people can believe the wrong things, but the wrong people, even if they believe the right things, can't be trusted with this liberty.
Exactly. And for him, the right people are basically Western Europeans and Americans. And in one sense, this is the text of a middle-aged man approaching death, worrying about his civilization. He looks around the world and he has spent his life as an imperial administrator. He's brought up by his father, who is the great imperial administrator of India. He's been brought up to believe, and he believes till the end of his days, that India in particular and other Oriental civilizations, as he would put it, are not in fact civilizations, societies. They are backward states of society. They are not moving forward. They are static. And they can only advance, in his terminology, through a form of Western despotism. That's why the British are there, in his view. He spends his life in the employ of the East India Company. He's their main propagandist. So he's a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist, and this affects his theory of speech, because in those societies, he believes that allowing freedom of expression is out of the question, because these people won't be able to benefit from it. They are not intellectually adult enough to be allowed to discuss things freely and thereby to intellectually advance individually and collectively. He thinks only the societies of Germany and England and France and so on have got to that stage and now should be allowed to be free to do that and further advance. But he's worried that they're slipping backwards into, at one point, he makes this horrible comparison to a kind of Chinese stasis. We're all becoming conformist like the Chinese, and he doesn't want that to happen. So this is his late in life cry out, cri de coeur, to stop that happening.
That touches on the point that you made earlier, which is, I believe, among the things that he thought made free speech dangerous in a society like India was that the people who would be on the receiving end of this explosion of information would actually be being influenced and corralled by wealthy, powerful people trying to manipulate them through the press. Something I think that in the 18th century version of this, the authors of Cato's letters would have fully understood that this is part of what the press does. It's about corralling opinion. And Mill could see that, whatever the distance was he had from India, not least never having been there, he could see that this explosion of opinion in what he thought was a society not equipped to sort of find its way through it just meant what you would get is people's views being entrenched, divisions being entrenched and stoked by unscrupulous manipulators. And yet it's hard to think of any society whose forms of public expression in the media, whether it's newspapers or more recently, doesn't include a version of that. This is mid-19th century Europe. The British press at this time was not a paragon of truth and virtue. Why did he not think that similar effects would take place anywhere that money and power and speech come together to try and shape public opinion, which it feels like a background fact of political life?
It's a very, very interesting blind spot in John Stuart Mill, but not just in his thinking, that more generally of the Anglophone intelligentsia, apart from very radical thinkers in the 19th century. So John Stuart Mill is asked several times his opinion on the press in India. Is the press in India not an organ of public opinion? If so, could we not speak of public opinion in India? And every time he's asked that question, like his father before him, he just bats it away and says, no, there is literally no public opinion in India. The press there is the plaything of rich people. It's not representative. And at the same time, he and his father before him and so on are constantly extolling the British press and the Western European press more generally as the organ of public opinion in a good way. This is for him a premise that he's grown up with. So there's that disconnect. And what makes it especially stark and striking is that by the middle of the 19th century, in 1859, when he publishes On Liberty, there is quite an established strain of thought across European intellectuals that says, hang on, actually, having observed the printing press and hoped, as people did throughout the 18th century, that it would basically be an organ of progress and truth, in the 19th century, people started to say, hey, hang on, no, this is not at all the case. The media's purpose and effect is to sell advertising and to make its owners richer and more politically powerful. And so out of that comes a very strong Marxist and Chartist and early socialist critique. And indeed, conservative thinkers in Germany. There's a great intellectual called Karl Knies, who writes the earliest studies of advertising and great treatises on newspapers and communication in the modern world and the telegraph and everything. They are all grappling with the role of the media and understanding how it really works. And Mill just doesn't engage with that at all. And that's a problem for his theory of free speech, as it is a problem for our own theories of free speech, which still don't really grapple with the question of the responsibilities of the media.
Could you say that by focusing on private freedom, the right to live as you choose, to experiment, to go wrong, to make a mess of your life, to say stupid things, to make a fool of yourself, these are all things that Mill defends and believes in, and he thinks there's a sort of nobility in all of that, including making a fool of yourself, being an eccentric. It's partly a defense of that as well. But by starting from the private, his theory then gets extrapolated into the public sphere. So it sort of turns on its head the previous version, which is you start in the public sphere and then maybe it gets extrapolated to the private sphere. This is the other way around. So it ends up treating newspapers like they were eccentric experimenters in living, because it's not really about power. In the 18th century, power was at the heart of these arguments. People understood power was crucial to making sense of the limits of speech in different forms. But if you start with the idea of as your template, a kind of eccentric person who's resisting the pressure of their conformist Anglican neighbours to go to church and this and that, and maybe their life is a little rickety, but it's not really a conception of brute social power. And so if you extrapolate it up to the level of rich people and newspapers and the people who shape and mold public opinion, it looks a little quaint.
Yes. The thing is, it makes perfect sense as an argument if you think of it as an argument for John Stuart Mill going through his life as he wanted to go through life and being allowed to say women should have the vote and being allowed to argue for contraception and being allowed to be radical in his private life and the rest of it and not doing anyone any real harm. But the problem is that he is mainly writing from that perspective. And so there are a couple of more fundamental ways in which it doesn't work as a theory for everyone and as an argument for free speech as fundamentally a right of the individual. So the first is, quite simply, that he starts off by saying speech and expression are clearly matters that are not restricted to individuals, they affect others. It's conduct that concerns other people. It's a social act. Those are some of the ways in which he describes it. But then he kind of forgets about that and tries to pretend that speech is actually just about the individual. And the most extraordinary place where he does that, where he tries to smuggle this past the readers, is where he says literally that the liberty of thought and the liberty of expression are the same thing. So the freedom of thought and the freedom of speech can't be separated. And he has a little paragraph where he says, well, this may seem strange to my readers, but they're so closely intertwined that really they can't be separated. And that's it. That's all he does. So again, he says in the abstract, we should allow doctrines that we may think are harmful to circulate, blah, 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 blah. He's happy to say that. He's happy to go that far. But then when it comes to harm to other individuals, he has to agree, and he puts this in very brief caveats, that if your speech harms other individuals, it shouldn't be allowed. That's not your own personal liberty. But he never quite squares the question of how you might then express views that are harmful to other people and have liberty to do that. That's where he just gets very fuzzy and quiet.
Is this the point where essentially freedom of speech and freedom of conscience seem to get run together? So if there is no difference between thought and expression, it sounds a little bit like everything you do in expressing your views is just an extension of kind of what's going on inside your head, and we mustn't curtail or limit that. And it is true, I think, in later arguments about free speech right up to today, that the two things do often get conflated. The idea is that anyone who is wanting to limit free speech is actually attacking freedom of conscience. And so this is a fundamental attack on what's thought to be a basic liberty that, in theory, liberals can agree on. And then you get these weird inversions of Mill's argument like now. So you take someone like J.D. Vance, let's move it on to the present, because these things, there is a thread running through this. J.D. Vance comes to Europe, as he did recently, and tells his European hosts that they are a threat to freedom of speech because not people who want to live experimental lives are being stifled by religious conformity, but people who want to live religious lives are being stifled by the kind of woke conformity of the age, the woke, secular, atheistic, possibly socialistic conformity of European life, which means that people who want to object to rights to abortion, say, are being constrained. And so it is like the running together of freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. So it's recognizably Mill's argument, I think. I mean, I think J.D. Vance, there probably is a thread that runs back to Mill, which is you mustn't stifle, just because you don't like it, it makes you uncomfortable, things that look to you obviously wrong. But he's turned it around because it's also about defending freedom of religion and religious conscience and expression. Whereas in Mill's case, it was kind of to defend secular free thinkers from religious conformity.
I like what you're doing as an intellectual argument, but I'm in admiration, speechless admiration for your attempt to ascribe to J.D. Vance some kind of intellectual hinterland when he made these statements. I think what they more clearly show is that freedom of speech has always been a weaponized slogan that people wield to support expressions of opinion that they are for. Just as censorship is a slogan that we apply to restrictions we don't agree with. Because, of course, if he is intellectually consistent and coherent, he wouldn't be part of an administration that is now censoring people on a horrific scale across the government and the society of the United States precisely for expressing or circulating or even investigating in scholarly terms ideas that they don't particularly want to engage with.
So in that sense, is he the heir to John Stuart Mill, not because there's a intellectual thread running through it, but because, as you've said, in John Stuart Mill's account, there is self-evidently a massive double standard, which is this is an argument for free speech in not just principle terms, but philosophical terms that comes with the caveat, but only for certain people, because certain people can be trusted with this thing and other people can't. And if the question is then, well, how do we distinguish between the people who can and can't be trusted? I don't think it's just with hindsight that we say, well, looked at from the outside, it looks like that's just prejudice.
I agree. He is doing something similar.
And do you think, in a way, all principled defences of free speech tend to be vulnerable to the charge that if you dig, you find that it, as throughout human history, everyone has recognised that there are caveats, everyone has recognised that there are limits, but the free speech absolutists, of whom Mill in a way was one, try and conceal it. And yet if you dig a bit, what you find is that, yeah, just like everyone else, they're caveating it because they don't think it applies to everyone. It applies to the kind of people they're comfortable having this right.
You can't be a free speech absolutist. It's an intellectually incoherent position. But it goes back to the alternative model, which is the liberty versus license. Let's just balance the right and the wrong ways of expressing ourselves. Everyone hates that up close because it's so clearly subjective and context dependent, and everyone wishes that the rules of speech could be simpler. And if you look at American jurisprudence since the 1960s, when they've really had the libertarian absolutist swerve, which up until then, Americans are quite similar to Europeans in their laws and attitudes to free speech. But anyway, one way of dealing with the problem of subjectivity and context is to strip all that out and just say, we're not going to talk about the context of speech. You can say whatever you like. We're not going to talk about harm. We're not going to talk about libel. We're just going to talk about, rules of time and place. That's all you've got left. So it makes it very simple to say maximal free speech and to hell with the consequences. That's the American approach jurisprudentially. But the problem with that is it's getting you very far away from how real speech works. And the point about free speech being an artificial, essentially incoherent doctrine is that it has to deny the two core facts about real communication. The first is it's an action in the world. It's not separate from action. It has effects. That's what it's for. And the second thing is it is exquisitely context dependent. It always is. The meaning of any utterance, its effects in the world, only begin with the words themselves, but they always have to do with who is speaking, to what audience, in what context, with what purpose. Is it a one-off? Is it a sequence? Is it the President of the United States saying this in public? Or is it me in the pub with my friends? The same words can have many, many different meanings and effects. And that's partly also about how the audience receives them. The ultimate meaning lies not in the intention of the speaker, but in the reception by the audience. So these are all basic facts about communication, but they don't sit at all well with laws and notions of individual rights, because those have to be consistent and transparent and treat everyone the same. And that's exactly not how communication really works. So that's the problem for free speech. Can never really overcome the difficulty that it should be determined in a context-dependent way, but then you get into the messiness of constantly balancing between liberty and license and constantly being on slippery slopes and constantly thinking about what is the context. I think that's a more honest way of going through life, but it makes things very frustrating for everyone, and it means we'll never have a simple set of rules and approaches, let alone a theory of free speech.
And yet what you call the libertarian swerve in the American case from the 60s onwards is shaping arguments about free speech around the world. It is in many ways the dominant mode in which people talk about it, or at least even if you're not yourself dominated by that approach, you have to address it because it is so present. And part of the reason it's so present is we also live in a world dominated by American technology companies, which have become not the exclusive, but the primary platforms on which people do express themselves, including in a kind of John Stuart Mill way. We live in a world where the scope for experiments in living and expression has been massively expanded by the ability of people to essentially publish their views to wider audiences in ways that would have been inconceivable in the 19th century. We can all use the technology that's available to be our own publishers of our views. And you do hear in 21st century defenses of online free speech, echoes of Mill, I think, the idea that the internet is at least potentially a vast playground for experiments in living. And at the same time, all of the blind spots, caveats, mistakes in Mill's argument seem writ even larger. This is so context dependent. This is an environment in which so much hangs on power relations and the ability to control the space in which this happens. And these technology companies, we've had a recent example of it, Meta signing up for Trump's free speech doctrine and then in the same breath trying to suppress a single book, the recent book by the whistleblower Sarah Wynne Williams, which is about them. The double standard is so breathtaking, you almost feel that they must. It's sort of some kind of performative joke. So it's also Mill's world in that way too. You can dress it up as a great experiment in experiments in living. And at the same time, my God, the double standards are everywhere now, aren't they?
The hypocrisy is just mind-blowing. But I mean, as a historian, there are two things I'd like to say. One is we're living through a media revolution. We have been for the last few decades. And that's always been the case when you see people agitating and arguing especially fiercely about free speech. That's where the first arguments about political free speech began in the media revolution of the early 18th century. Then Mill and other theorists of the 19th century talking about, again, the telegraph, the speed of communication, the daily news press of the 19th century is, again, a phenomenon that people felt was revolutionary. And the same is true for us. So in that sense, there is a history to this that we could learn from. And Mill doesn't partake, as I said earlier, of the insights of other theorists in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And one of the tragedies of what we're living through now is that actually Americans too, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, started to see that the media was a problem for free speech, not the neutral conduit of opinion, but something that was shaping things in certain ways and not in others, suppressing certain voices, amplifying others, and especially the question of power and money. Now, this became an international concern, partly because the communists and socialists had been banging on about this since the early 19th century. And then the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia created a model for an alternative approach to the news press and politics in general, of course. So the threat and the inspiration of these alternative ways of thinking about the media are part of what animates people in the 20s and 30s. And then the other thing that happens, of course, is in the 1940s and 50s, people are looking back at the Holocaust, they're looking back at the Nazis and thinking, well, this is also something that happened partly because of the spread of horrible lies and misinformation and propaganda. And out of that comes a moment which culminates in the United States and in Europe in a vision of free speech that's very different. It's a very brief moment, it's an inspiring moment, but we've lost sight of it. And that is the idea that freedom of speech is not just about the rights of individuals or about the rights of media corporations or indeed just about the powers of government. It also has to be about the responsibilities of the media. And everyone had come to agree this by the 1940s. And even in the United States, the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court moves towards recognizing, for example, the right to strike and the right to picket as related to the right of free speech. These are collective forms of action. Socialists and communists had long argued that freedom of speech should not be just seen as an individual, but a collective right. And then The most important insight is that it should also encompass the right of citizens to truthful information. It's not okay just to have a world in which massive media conglomerates tell you what to think. There should be some responsibility to the truth and to the interests of the citizenry and the public good. And so you see this in the formulation, for example, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the United Nations at the end of the 1940s, where the right to free speech includes the right to be informed and to receive information. You also see it in the Human Rights Act in Europe, European Convention on Human Rights, that now is the basis for British law as well, has the similar notion of freedom of speech as the right to receive information as well as to speak out. It's the right of the audience as well as the right of the speaker. And so we might have had a jurisprudence and a popular understanding that moved closer to grappling with the moment we've now found ourselves in. Unfortunately, what happened was the Cold War. And that, at the end of the 1950s, led to an American jurisprudential swerve, a political swerve, a social swerve, away from any thought that we should be thinking primarily in terms of the common good and commonality in general, and kind of retreat to the idea that individual rights and freedoms were what made America great and that characterized the West as opposed to totalitarian systems. And that led in turn to a falling back on the idea of the First Amendment as really just being about the rights of individuals and corporations against government. And the only thing that was left was this notion that the media should behave responsibly. And if you get into the weeds, that's the moment in the United States when you start to get journalism treated as a profession that people should be trained for, and that corporations in the news business have a responsibility to the public, and they start to articulate these things in various ways. It leads to the kind of what we now call legacy media landscape of the 60s and 70s. There's the fairness doctrine that the American broadcasting watchdog, the FEC, for a long time had in its statutes as well. So there are all sorts of ways in which they're trying to deal with the question of the media, but they're all quite weak by comparison to a constitutional amendment that's phrased in this ridiculous, absolutist, clumsy, rhetorical way that goes back to these two venal journalists in London in 1721 that says, Congress shall make no law.
It's almost as though that period in the 40s, when there was an understanding, or the makings of an understanding, that free speech had to take account of context, but also the common good that was being pursued. What happened after that was a move back to these earlier versions, in a way. You trace the line back Mill through to the 18th century. But still within that was retained the idea that there is a difference between liberty and license. And in a sense, the high ideals, sometimes somewhat pompous ideals of the American journalistic profession are built on the understanding that there still has to be a difference between responsible exercise of the liberty of the press and a kind of license. That became the framework, but now in a world in which that line has been completely erased, because also behind the ideology of the internet age is a notion that license is itself what we mean by liberty, because it is a licentious world out there. It's a licentious world online. And so it's almost like the story has gone back through itself in phases and even erase the distinction on which those early 18th century ideas of free speech was nonetheless built, which is, we have our line that we draw somewhere between liberty and license. And bit by bit, the jurisprudential story, which has become a very influential way of thinking about this around the world, has just undone each of those sets of reservations.
The American jurisprudential story has done that. And now, because we live in a world dominated by American corporations who are primarily concerned with making money and take their principled cues from that American jurisprudence, we're all struggling with the effects of that. But I think you're right to say that in the longue durée, if you take a very long historical look at this, then what stands out as exceptional is just this brief moment in the mid and later 20th century where there was an attempt and a serious achievement at building institutions of news that had as their primary focus the conveying of truth. This imperfect world, partisan world dominated, of course, by financial concerns as well. But the legacy media, as we now sneeringly call them, did all have that in common, that they sought somehow to present truthful news to the general public in the public interest. And actually, looking back over the centuries, that is an exceptional moment because that doesn't exist before the 17th century and the 18th century. In those worlds, everyone knows that misinformation is rife. It's very hard to get trustworthy news. And if you're very rich, can you pay for overseas newsletters to keep you up to date on what's happening? But it's very hard to navigate the misinformation and the fog of unknowing until you get to the 18th century. Then you get an explosion, technological media revolution. Newsprint becomes a huge new thing. But again, everyone living in that world knows that this is a world of smoke and mirrors. There's a great quote by Jonathan Swift, who's living through that, specifically about this new media world, where he says something like, the lie is the swiftest thing there is. Lies spread with immense rapidity and multiply and metastasize, and the truth, by comparison, can only ever limp slowly afterwards, never catches up. And he says, it's got this wonderful simile, it's like a man who's thought of a witty repartee many hours after the company has parted. So the truth is slow, lies will always win, misinformation is everywhere, the world of the media is corrupt. Everyone in the 18th century knew this. And then there's a brief moment where people think the liberty of the press will improve things. Pretty soon, by the 19th century, they're again obsessing about the problems of the media being corrupt and venal and misinformation and the rest of it. So the attempt to tackle that systematically and the attempt to institutionalize professional standards and so on, it's still with us, but its high point has surely passed, and that was the age before the internet. And once you get people as the most powerful publishers in the world, as we now have the gurus of the internet who don't care about truth, care about money, think that all information is equivalent. That's a very basic premise that goes right back to the early days of Google. There's no sense that some information is more important than other information, or that some truths are harder to arrive at than others. You just hoover it all up and put it out there, and then surely people will figure it out for themselves. That's the ethos in its benign form. And now I think we're living with the ethos in its malign form, which is we don't care if it causes harm. We're just talking about the West here, but these portals have gone around the world and people have died on a large scale in other countries where they just don't care. The American corporations don't care about what happens in Burma. As long as everyone is hooked up to the Facebook and advertisers are happy, that's their priority. So if we can have laws that tackle that, we'll be in better shape. If we just think, as the Americans do, well, that's not what the First Amendment means, we'll be in trouble.
If it is true, therefore, that period when a different approach was at least tried is the exception, not the rule, and it was relatively brief, and it itself looks a little like an accident of history. It's highly contingent. It exists between other periods. The Cold War clearly discredited for many people the idea of government regulating the truth in any way. The previous period was built on ideas of freedom of the press that discredited themselves. So as a historian, you look back and you see the moment where something emerges which is different and it gets snuffed out very quickly. And so now it's very easy for people to say to you, that is so nostalgic, it's quaint itself. You've got a sort of vision of a world that's long, long gone. Is there nonetheless in that story, do you think, the basis for optimism? I mean, my instinct is that it's so brief and it's so contingent and it's so historically specific that there's very little in it that is consoling. But do you take a different view?
I could take a different view, which is that even before the 18th century, there have been ways in which people have struggled communally to find the truth. And scholarship is a good example of that. Universities go back way before freedom of the press is eulogized. And as long as we have institutions, and I don't just mean scholars, but I also mean journalists and other truth finders who have that as their aim, and as long as there is some sense within the society as a whole that is a valuable aim and that is worth giving these people authority to hold up what the truth really is, then we might have a chance. But what's happening in the United States right now is the opposite of that. So I'm not optimistic. I just think there is a chance.
Since we put out our last episode from the Regent Street Cinema in London with Helen Lewis talking about Network, we have been asked whether we're planning more film events, and we are. In the autumn, we're hoping to do a series of films at that cinema followed by live podcast recordings. We'll tell you more about it near the time. The theme of the series is going to be movies about big ideas. Next time in the history of revolutionary ideas, I'm going to be talking to the historian Bruno Leipold about Karl Marx, and particularly about how Marx's ideas of revolution changed in 1871 with the Paris Commune. And we are going to be spending a bit of time in Paris because after that we have a mini-series with the theatre director and writer Dominique Drangul talking about 3 revolutionary days in Paris that changed the history of modern art. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.